Hello, good day everybody. I hope all of you are doing fine. So for today's lesson, we shall study how plants transports water, minerals, and sugar throughout the plant's body. So we have to take note that plants, they don't have any pumping organ, unlike animals. So the question now is, how is water transported against the pull of gravity without any pumping system or circulatory system? So how is water transported against the pull of gravity from the roots up the xylem of the stem and to the leaves of plants? So this is a very interesting topic. So how does water move up through a plant without using any pumping organ? So to give you an overview of this lesson, let's take note of the following. Alright, so the success of plants depends on their ability to gather and conserve resources from their environment. Alright, number 2, the transport of materials is central to the integrated functioning of the whole plant. And number 3, mechanisms like diffusion, active transport, bulk flow, they work together to transfer water, minerals, nutrients throughout the plant's body. So that's the overview of this lesson for today. Now we have to take note that land plants, they acquire resources both above and below ground. So resources like water and minerals from the soil and carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. So water, as we know, is very essential for photosynthesis. Water is one of the main raw materials for photosynthesis. Also, carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, they enter the plant. So carbon dioxide and water, they are the essential raw materials for photosynthesis. The plants give up sugar and oxygen. Alright, so land plants, they acquire these resources both above and below ground. Alright, and as we all know in evolutionary biology, that plants came from algae, the ancestral algae. So the algal ancestors of these land plants, they absorb water, minerals, and even carbon dioxide directly from the surrounding water through simple diffusion. Alright, and after millions of years, such algal ancestors evolved into the members of division Bryophyta. Members of division Bryophyta, these are plants without any vascular tissues, like liverworts. And such plants, members of division Bryophyta, those without any vascular tissues, without xylem and phloem, they absorb essential materials like water, minerals, and even carbon dioxide directly from their surroundings through simple diffusion. Alright? Xylem and phloem allowed long-distance transport of water, minerals, and products of photosynthesis. And this was achieved by plants from division Tracheophyta. So after millions of years came the evolution of the members of division Tracheophyta, or the vascular plants. Vascular plants, they are equipped with xylem and phloem. And such tissues, xylem and phloem, allowed long-distance transport of such important materials like water, minerals, and also products of photosynthesis like sugar, and oxygen is released as a waste gas. So take note, this was an evolutionary breakthrough, the evolution of the xylem and the phloem. And this allowed plants to transport minerals, nutrients, and water through long distances, and this allowed the plants to grow taller and larger. Alright, so here is a cross section of the stem with vascular tissues in it. Alright, so at this point, let us now differentiate in relation to water transport terms such as source and sink. So what is now the difference between source and sink? Now when we speak of source, this means that this is the plant part where the sugar starts its journey. So this is either where sugar is produced, like in the leaves, or where sugar is stored, like in the roots. So that's what we meant by source. This is where the sugar is either produced, like in the leaves, so the leaves is a source, or stored, like in the roots. So sugar is stored also in the roots, like those of the potato plant or the carrot. Alright, now when we speak of sink, sink means where sugar ends up, either where it is needed or will it be stored. Like for example, flowers. So we know that flowers contain nectar, and nectar is a good source of sugar. So the sugar will be needed by the flower. Or for example, fruit. Fruit can also be a sink. Alright, so that's where the sugar ends up. That's why most fruits are sweet, because the sugar ends up there, so fruits, or in the flower where there is nectar. So that's what we meant by sink. This is the part of the plant where sugar ends up, either where it is needed or will be stored. Alright, so again, when we speak of source, this is where the sugar is either produced as a product of photosynthesis. So source could be leaves. So the leaves are the sites for photosynthesis, and the main product of photosynthesis is sugar. So the leaves is a source. Alright, or where sugar is stored. So the sugar can be stored in the roots. The roots can also be a source. Alright, and when we speak of sink, that's where the sugar is needed, like the flower. The flower contains nectar, and nectar is sugar. Also fruits. That's why most fruits are sweet, because the sugar ends up there, either in the fruit or in the flower. So the fruit and the flower, they are considered sink. Source, leaves or roots. Sink, flowers and fruits. Alright, so I hope that's clear about the difference between source and sink. Alright, so let's talk about now in detail these vascular tissues, starting with the xylem. So the xylem transports water from the roots up to the stem and to the leaves of plants. And these xylem vessels, they are like long tubes, and they are dead at maturity. Alright, so here is a photomicrograph of the xylem vessels. So again, they are like long tubes. Mga tubo lang yan. Alright, so that's how we describe the xylem. And the tissues here are dead at maturity. Alright, now for the phloem, phloem tissue transports sap, that is water and sugar, from source, which is the leaves, to the sink, either fruits or the flower. And phloem vessels are alive, no? They are made of living cells at maturity, but they needed companion cells. Alright, so let's take a look again at this photomicrograph of the xylem vessels and the phloem. So like what we mentioned earlier, the phloem tissues, they are alive together with companion cells and sieve tube elements. Alright, and everybody kindly take a look at this illustration of the xylem vessel and the phloem vessel. So if you will take a look at this, the flow of water to the xylem vessel is one way. There is only one way flow of water water through the xylem vessels. Alright, and again in the xylem vessel, there are no end walls between the cells. So tuloy-tuloy yung tubo, yung daloy ng water and minerals. And the xylem vessel walls, they are thick, alright, with lignin, right? Contains lignin. Now for the phloem vessels, again in the phloem we have the transport of sugar and water, and the cells have end walls with perforations, so those are the sieve tube elements. And again, if you will notice, the flow of materials in the phloem vessel is two-way. There's a two-way flow of water and sugar in the phloem vessel. Alright, so before we continue, let's take a look at this very interesting video about the xylem and the phloem. Alright, let's watch this.
We could just say movement of water and minerals and movement of glucose and amino acids, but this is science, and so we like to have special terms to describe these processes. In this three-part video, we are going to look at the transport systems in plants for moving food, water and minerals around. We have a beating heart and circulating blood, but what do plants do? Cut a plant open and it doesn't bleed. So what happens instead? Plants have their own systems. They have a xylem, which moves water and solutes from the roots to the leaves, and a phloem, which moves glucose made in the leaves by photosynthesis and amino acids to the rest of the plant. Here are the xylem, and here are the phloem. Notice how the arrangement is different in the stem and the roots. The xylem and the phloem are found in groups called vascular bundles, and the position of these bundles changes for different parts of the plant. Both the xylem and the phloem are made up of rows of cells that form a continuous tube running the whole length of the plant. The xylem vessels are made of elongated dead cells that are impermeable to water and have walls containing lignin, a woody material. Because of this, xylem vessels are tough, which is why the vascular bundles in the roots are in the center. They help prevent the plant being pulled out of the ground. They are also more protected in the center. Whereas the stem has to resist being squashed and bent, and so it has the vascular bundles nearer to the edge to give the stem strength and support. The phloem vessels are made up of living cells. They transport sucrose and amino acids up and down the plant, depending upon where they are needed. Whereas in the xylem, the movement is just one way, from the roots up to the leaves. So we know that water and minerals go up the xylem, and amino acids and glucose go up and down the phloem. But how? In the second part of this video, we are going to look at the xylem and transpiration.
Alright, so I hope everything is clear about the functions of the xylem and the phloem. Alright, so at this point, let us now continue. Let us now study long-distance transport. Now, efficient long-distance transport of fluid require bulk flow, the movement of a fluid that is driven by the following factors such as pressure, adhesion, and cohesion. Alright, and water and solutes move together through the tracheids and vessel elements of the xylem and the sieve tube elements of the phloem. So we were able to describe these vascular tissues a while ago. Alright, and the efficient movement of fluids through long-distance transport is possible because these mature tracheids and vessel elements, they have no cytoplasm, no walang hindrance sa kanilang flow. And sieve tube elements have few organelles in their cytoplasm that will also contribute to the minimal hindrance of the flow of water and sugar in the phloem vessels. No, kaya konti lang yung mga organelles nila in their cytoplasm. Remember, phloem tissue is made up of living cells. Yung mga tracheids naman, they are dead at maturity, so they have no cytoplasm. So there is no hindrance to the flow of water through the xylem vessel. Alright? Okay, so water transport is composed of a three-part process. So we have first transpiration or evapotranspiration. This is the transport of water and minerals from the roots to the leaves. And transpiration involves a three-step process. So we have absorption at the roots, capillary action in the xylem vessel, and evaporation at the leaves. Alright, so let us now go into the details of these three basic steps in transpiration, starting with the absorption of water and minerals at the roots. Alright, now roots absorb water and minerals in a four-step process. Alright, so take note. Number 1, active transport of minerals into the root hairs. Number 2, diffusion to the pericycle. Number 3, active transport into the vascular cylinder where the xylem is located, and eventually diffusion into the xylem. Alright, so water enters the root hairs by means of osmosis, and this process will continue until it reaches the xylem vessels. So if you will take a look at this illustration, so water enters the root hairs by osmosis, and this will continue until the water reaches the xylem vessels. Alright, okay, and water is transported through the following pathways through the root tissues. So we have the apoplastic pathway of water and the symplastic pathway of water. Anyway, we will go into the details of the differences between the apoplastic pathway and the symplastic pathway of water. Alright, so water enters through the root hairs. Now, most water and mineral absorption occurs near the root tips, where the epidermis is permeable to water and where the root hairs are located. And the root hairs accounts much of the surface area of the roots. And also the root hairs accounts for most of water absorption. Then after soil solution enters the roots, the extensive surface area of the cortical cell membranes enhances this uptake of water and selected minerals. Alright, so again here is an illustration of a cross-section of the root with root hairs. Okay, alright, and as you could see, there's a blue-green dot. So that blue-green dot represents water, and if you will look at this animation, so water enters the root hairs, then it passes through the cortical cells, right, and eventually reaches the xylem vessels. Alright, so that's how water enters the root tissues. So water passes through the root hairs, again via osmosis, and then it reaches the epidermis, and then it passes through the cortical cells of the ground tissue, and then reaching the endodermis. Eventually it passes through the endodermis and reaches the xylem vessels. And just like what we mentioned earlier, water moves through the root tissues following these two pathways. So water and minerals, they travel through the plant by the following pathways or routes. So we have the symplastic pathway or symplastic route, and the apoplastic pathway or the apoplastic route. Alright, so at this point, let us now differentiate between symplastic and apoplastic pathway, starting with the symplastic route or the symplastic pathway. Now, water and minerals enters the root tissues through the cytoplasm. Alright, take note, in the symplastic pathway, water and minerals passes through the cytoplasm of the root cells. Water enters the root hairs, alright, across the partially permeable membrane, again by osmosis. And just like what we mentioned in passive transport, water molecules, they move from a region of high concentration in the soil to a region of lower concentration in the cells, down the concentration gradient. So water moves across the roots from cytoplasm to cytoplasm down the concentration gradient. Now, how is that possible? How does water crosses the roots from cytoplasm to cytoplasm? Remember that the plants, they are surrounded by the cell wall. Right now, these root cells, they have openings in them called plasmodesmata, and this is how water enters from one cell to the other cell through their cytoplasm. They will enter through the plasmodesmata. Then water moves into the xylem by osmosis upon reaching the xylem vessels, and they have to do that by crossing the endodermis. And this is a very important pathway for water. This is how water crosses the root tissues and eventually reaching the xylem vessels. So again, this is the symplastic pathway wherein the water crosses the cytoplasm. Water moves from cytoplasm to cytoplasm, passing through those openings or the plasmodesmata. So that's the symplastic pathway. Alright, here is another illustration showing the symplastic pathway. So again, water enters the root hairs via osmosis and then reaching the epidermis, again through cytoplasm to cytoplasm, then reaching the cortical cells. So again through the cytoplasm. So in order to do that, they have to pass through these openings or plasmodesmata. And upon reaching the endodermis, they will enter the pericycle and eventually reaching the xylem vessels. Alright, so I hope everything is clear about the symplastic pathway of water. Now let's proceed now with the apoplastic pathway or the apoplastic route. Now water enters the root tissues through this pathway by passing through the cellulose cell wall and the intercellular spaces of the root cells. So in the apoplastic pathway, water moves through the cellulose cell wall and intercellular spaces. Now the cell wall is permeable to water. The permeable fibers of cellulose do not resist water flow. Right, and eventually upon reaching the endodermis, water cannot pass through the endodermis through this pathway, right? Because in the endodermis there is a structure called the Casparian strip. Okay, so the Casparian strip in the endodermis cell wall is permeable to water. So water cannot pass through the endodermis because of this Casparian strip. Now the Casparian strip is a waterproof band of suberin. So all the water must pass the endodermis via the cytoplasm through the symplastic pathway. Water cannot reach the xylem vessels through the apoplastic pathway because water is prevented from entering the endodermis because of this suberin made Casparian strip. So this will allow the control or the regulation of the entry of water in the xylem vessel. Alright, the apoplastic pathway is important when transpiration rates are high as it is faster and requires no energy. Alright, so as you could see in this illustration, in the apoplastic pathway, water enters through the cellulose cell walls and the intercellular spaces. Okay, but upon reaching the endodermis, water is prevented from entering. Alright, now the endodermis is the innermost layer of cells in the root cortex, and again the endodermis surrounds the vascular cylinder and is the last checkpoint for selective passage of minerals from the cortex into the vascular tissues. So water cannot enter through the endodermis through the apoplastic pathway. Okay, water can cross the cortex via the symplastic pathway only. Okay, Alright, so I guess that's it for the difference between the symplastic pathway and the apoplastic pathway. So again, in the symplastic pathway, as you could see in this illustration, so water enters through cytoplasm to cytoplasm, passing through the plasmodesmata, and water eventually reaches the endodermis. It passes through the endodermis and reaching the xylem vessels. But through the apoplastic pathway, water flows through the cellulose cell walls and intercellular spaces, but water does not enter the endodermis, again because of the Casparian strip. Okay, so here is another illustration showing the symplastic pathway and the apoplastic pathway. So again, in the symplastic pathway, water enters the root tissues through cytoplasm to cytoplasm via the plasmodesmata upon reaching the xylem vessels. They reach the xylem vessels. But in the apoplastic pathway, water passes through the cell wall and the intercellular spaces, but they are prevented from entering the endodermis, again because of the Casparian strip. Okay, so I hope that's clear for the difference between the apoplastic pathway and the symplastic pathway. Okay, the Casparian strip, as we mentioned earlier, controls water movement into the vascular cylinder, and water cannot move between cells. It must move through the cells by osmosis. So the Casparian strip is very important in regulating the flow of water through the root tissues. So the Casparian strip is made up of suberin. It's waterproof and it prevents the water from entering the endodermis via the apoplastic pathway. Okay, alright, the waxy Casparian strip of the endodermal wall blocks apoplastic transfer of water and minerals from the cortex to the vascular cylinder. Okay, yan, so apoplastic block. The Casparian strip again is made of suberin, which is impermeable to water. Water is unable to pass through the endodermis by the apoplastic route. So water enters the xylem vessels only through the symplastic pathway. Okay, so the endodermis actively transports salt into the xylem vessels, lowering the concentration in the xylem, so water moves down the gradient by osmosis. So anyway, we'll go into the details of that later on. Okay, so at this point, let's watch this video about the difference between symplastic and apoplastic pathways. Alright, let's watch this.
Water reaches the xylem of a flowering plant in three ways: apoplastic, symplastic, and vacuolar. It passes from the root hair cells through the parenchymal cells to the endodermis and Caspian strip, and then the xylem. In the apoplastic process, water enters the mesh-like structure of the cell walls and continues until it reaches the endodermis. Then it encounters the water-impermeable Caspian strip. As a result, it is driven into the cytoplasm. This is the apoplastic block. It is now under control of the cells, whereas previously it was not. The symplastic process is through the cytoplasm. Water is absorbed into the root hair cells through their membranes by osmosis. It is passed through the plasmodesmata between parenchymal cells by osmosis. Remember, plasmodesmata are small holes in the cell walls between neighboring cells. And the water reaches the xylem. In the vacuolar process, water is again absorbed by osmosis. However, it travels from vacuole to vacuole through the plasmodesmata. Once the endodermis is reached, though, the water travels through the cytoplasm or vacuole onto the xylem.